Oh, well, hold that thought. They are slated to start the week of the 13th. Okay, that depends on how much room I can cover, because we lose next Monday because of Labor Day. So we may end up pushing it back by a week, which is fine. Neither here nor there. Okay, Mia.
Nothing bad this time.
Oh, well, I'm so glad.
You mentioned last week that you were going to switch the days of lecture and groups.
Right.
So did you do that for this
class? That's just for the group processing one. Or Shame and Grace on Tuesday, Thursday.
Is this not Shame and Grace?
Beg your pardon?
Sections of the same class.
Right. You're in group processing, right?
I guess so.
You guess so.
So are groups for this class on Mondays and Wednesdays?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Ignore it.
I got it now.
Yeah, and I had misread my daughter's reservations of rooms for her group. Did you guys figure that convoluted email I sent you? Because I had thought that I can't even explain what I had thought, but her group mirrors this class time. Okay, so that means her group will meet exactly at the same time as the class, just in another location. Okay, so the that are in my group are going to meet in this room. People that are in Corey's group are going to meet in Patrick Henry 101 or whatever it is over there. Okay. Because it literally mimics all three of my classes that have groups in them, literally. So Shame and Grace, the only wild card, you guys are in group processing. Is there anybody else in group processing in here? Okay. The only class that doesn't get that is group processing, because that's such a big class and I want to keep the group sizes low. And so I'm still that out, because if I do it any other way and I allow Corey's group to be the other group in group processing, which doesn't affect most of you anyway, then those groups would be at 12 or more, and that's just too big to try to teach about group processing stuff. So that's the rationale. The groups that I have on Thursday is group processing and Shame and Grace, and they both have groups to them. Can you imagine how fun that would be, right? So when we move into doing groups each week, I'm just flipping it so they don't have to walk from one group to another, that's all. So you look still terribly confused.
It's fine, I'll talk to you about it later.
Okay. Anything else? So more likely than not, since we're losing Monday, more likely than not, this class's groups are going to start on the 20th, okay, on that week, rather than the 13th, because we lose a whole day on next week. Okay, anything else? All right, well, we're going to continue to plow through the Safe People stuff. And I guess what I would encourage you to do, even as we go through it, is there's always two levels to this material. Our thoughts tend to drift toward the people in our lives and not drift toward me as an unsafe person. And so now the biggest challenge, given the topic of this class, the biggest challenge is I start hearing characteristics and stuff that we'll be going through today, and where will I lapse? I will lapse straight into shame, which makes it impossible to evaluate anything, okay? Shame, by its very nature, condemns first. And grace, by its very nature, accepts first. And you can see that theme within Scripture itself. And then there's an opportunity to learn. Shame stunts learning. And it's oftentimes it's the very thing that stunts relationships, because shame stunts learning. Because I don't want to make a mistake. If I don't make a mistake, how can I learn? last I checked, most of us learn from making a mistake, not doing it right every time. So, being said, even as I go through this material, most of the time what I've seen is students will fall one of two ways. Either they will, oh crap, I'm a really unsafe person, or they'll fall the other way and say, oh crap, I'm surrounded by unsafe people. And guess what? It's both, okay? And so, and that's just a warning more than anything else. So let me pray real quick, and we'll get going. Father, guide our hearts into the things that you have waiting for us today. I thank you for faithfulness, your love, and grace that allows us the space to learn, to grow into the identity that you've given us freely, just completely freely. So guide us into that. Allow us to hear the voice of Shema, identify it for what it is, and be able to slowly but surely build up a resistance to it. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so I ended on talking about this and the idea of judgment versus character discernment. We've gotten drilled so hard by our culture about not judging that we quit discerning. And it requires an extra level, really, of understanding, of practice, of all of those things. Generally speaking, discernment stays at a descriptive level. So when I'm being discerning, I'm looking at from purely a descriptive place where somebody is, how they behave, how they interact with me, everything else. In judgment, there's always a therefore. Therefore, and then we make a conclusion. And that's usually where judgment takes us. Therefore, I'm a bad person. Therefore, they're a bad person. Therefore, I should never have them in my life or expunge them out of my life or anything like that. And the irony in all of this material that I talk about in this class is kind of the interior-exterior kind of tension. Because it's easy for me to pay attention to the stuff that's going on exterior to me, not nearly pay attention to the stuff that's going on interior to me, even me with me. Okay? Don't miss that point. I mean, we're talking about this in interpersonal and personal characteristics, but don't miss the point that we're oftentimes patently unsafe with ourselves, too. And so that's just another dimension that I don't really necessarily take the time to unpack it entirely, but we can certainly. I think even in groups, the thing that I will tell you in light of this material, and that's why I do these two big kind of talks, is on safe people and on boundaries, is it sets you up to be able to engage groups a little differently. The thing to keep in mind is the minute that somebody is safe enough to share with you how what you have said or done impacted them. Now remember what I said. They are safe enough to share with you how you've impacted them. The first place most of us go is shame. Okay? I'm a bad person. I can't do anything right. I'm terrible. I'm taking what we talked about in the first lecture. I'm never enough. All of that. And that makes it virtually impossible to grow. So there's always this tension, I think, that we live in, because grace, we think in a lot of ways, and you're reading it in Philip Yancey's book, but grace is like it's too good to be true. And if anything's too good to be true, it probably is. That's what we conclude. And therefore, then, we just turn it into a contract. I'll do this for that. And we do that with God as well. So we choose a lot of friendships and a lot of based on outward appearances. Once we get into relationship, people, we begin to experience their interior. And as a general rule, if we're been told don't judge, and I interact with an interior of somebody that sends up some red flags, more often than not, I've seen people just shove the flags down because why? They don't want to judge them, which suspends their ability to set boundaries at all. And that's where the problem oftentimes comes up. So what I want to walk you through is kind of three profiles, if you will, okay? And no one person is an unsafe person. No one person is one of these. But I think it's worth paying attention to identify how much we do this, how much we may have people in our lives that do this. So the first one is, in terms of kind of answering this question, who are they, is the abandoners. And abandoners start out really strong, lots of promises of companionship and consistency and fidelity, but at some point in time they leave. Sometimes it's at the point in time we need them the most. But they leave and they ghost us, as the word goes. And so they start relationships and really can't finish it. So, oftentimes, I'm sure you probably have heard the phrase, abuse people abandon people as well. And so in a lot of cases, the longer we're in a relationship, and it's like, it's like a lot of relationships in college too. They start out brightly shining, and before too long they peter out. And so why is that? Well, there are lots of reasons why people begin to kind of fade away. Some of it is because they're getting more closer to somebody. They're making predictions in their head about what will happen if they continue to get close to somebody. Okay? And that's the idea of hearing authentic closeness. Now, I'll wrap myself out right out of the gates. And like I said to you before, I'm not going to ask you to go places I haven't gone. And the reality is as a kid, I grew up as an only kid. My dad died when I was 12. I grew up pretty much alone. As a matter of fact, I even chose a sport that I could practice alone. And that was basketball. I didn't need anybody to do that. I could do it all by myself. But what I didn't realize is that when my dad died, I said, I will never trust anybody again. Now, it didn't look that way if you looked at me and my friendships and relationships and things like that. It didn't look that way. But what's interesting is the way that it starts getting translated into relationships is it dials down the trust level, and only so much is offered to the person that I'm in relationship with. It puts a ceiling on it, a safe ceiling on it. And so it slowly but surely created a pattern where, particularly in friendships, that I would get into it, and I have one friend in particular. Some of you guys have heard me talk about him, the former professor at SPU, and we've been friends for 28 years. Okay. He had an understanding of consistency in relationship that I couldn't even begin to understand, and I didn't when we first met, because I threw myself into the relationship, I threw myself into the ministry he was doing, I threw myself into all of that stuff, and before too long, I started to fade. And the thing that he taught me about was he bridged the gap to come back to me and say, come back into relationship. And I had to learn it. I was an abandoner because I had somebody very significant abandon me. And so what do? I will abandon before I am abandoned. Or I will hurt me before you hurt me. See, all of those things come play, and that's not excusing the behavior, but it happens that way. Today, I'm a very different person as a result of his graciousness to hang with me, to invite me back into relationship. I would not probably have done so otherwise. And now I have other relationships that, guess what? I'm doing that because I learned it. So at that point in time, I would have been one of these people. I would have been the poster child for this one, because it was I'm going to leave before you leave, because you really will leave eventually. And we do that in a lot of relationships that way. Now remember what I've said to you before. You guys have heard me. You've been in enough of my classes. You know, the whole idea of trust and control can't coexist, right? When I dial down the trust guess what gets dialed up is the control. Managing perceptions, managing information, managing things. Those two dials mimic each other, except in the reverse. And so that is an example of just how that the problem is what abandoners don't know is how they end up destroying trust in the future for the people that they have abandoned. And so people say, I've been abandoned, and what is our propensity to say? What is wrong with me? Now it's what's wrong with them. What's wrong with me? Okay? And when I make that conclusion, shame's banging at the door if it hasn't kicked it down already. And that's, abandoners have that effect. They don't know that because they're long gone. But it certainly is part of it. Another one is the critics. The critics are people who oftentimes take a very parental role with somebody. If you feel very childlike in the presence of somebody else, they probably are a critic. And so they are judgmental. They are making the therefore statement, and you feel it when you're around a critic. They speak the truth without love. They really have no room for grace or forgiveness. Now that doesn't mean they don't talk about it. They talk about it all the time. But oftentimes when we start comparing the landscape of our relationship with this person and conclude, wait a minute, there's no grace here at all. It's like every time I turn around, I'm doing something wrong. And they good graces are going to help me be a better person. So critics are concerned with confronting errors rather than making a connection. And the very nature of a critic is always inserting distance into a relationship. They don't come close. They stand from afar. And in a lot of cases, they confuse weakness with sinfulness. So the limitations of being human, in the global sense of the term, you can make a good case. Yes, it is all paths lead back to sin. But there's a lot of ways in terms of how we think about ourselves and other things that are very much tied to human weakness, not sinfulness. Now, I'm not implying that sin is only done when I intend to do that. There's lots of, presumptuous, not presumptuous, but kind of unconscious sin. Things that we do and we look back and it's like, oops, that was not a good thing to do, and I need to talk to somebody or whatever. But they have a way, and again, a lot of this is not overt, but they have a way of condemning people for being weak. That's the critic. And again, and I'll just put this out there and just let you chew on it. But what is my inner voice? Is it an abandoning one, or is it a critical one, or is it both all? Because it can be. It's that interior-exterior thing that I was talking about before. So the critics are out there, and in a lot of cases, probably in the Christian community, this is a primary mode. Because we spend our time trying to correct things rather than connect with people. And is that easier? Of course it is. It's always easier to do that. Armchair quarterback it for everybody. So the critics. The last one are the irresponsibles. The irresponsibles are blasted to be around. They don't take care of themselves or anyone else. They don't take responsibility for their actions. They're not much at delaying gratification. They're none of these things, and they don't follow through. Now, oftentimes the irresponsibles can look a lot like abandoners because they don't follow through. They promise plenty and don't do it. And so the irresponsibles are the people that are pretty fun to be around, really. I mean, If you're in a crowd of people and you say, I feel like running downtown and getting something to eat or whatever, they're the people that are sitting beside you whispering in your ear going, do it. And then you go, you stay up too late, can't get up the next morning for class, and they don't pay any of the consequences. So irresponsibles are the nature of the way that they interact. Now, the funny thing about it is, for many of us as Christians, and we use the words even in our faith about being saved, there are a lot of us that have this propensity of appointing ourselves as Messiah for everybody else, which means the irresponsibles are a prime target of people with a Messiah complex. They want to save them. And so if you're drawn to irresponsible people, here's a list of things you may find yourself doing. Picking up after them, apologizing to others for them. Oh, they didn't mean it. They were just being themselves. Make excuses. Give them chance after chance after chance. Oh, this time I'll do it better this time. Well, okay. And then I get burned again. And sooner or later, somebody like me as a counselor looks at them and says, well, do you know this person? And why aren't you using the information you know about them to actually help you set the kind of limits that you probably should set? Ultimately, we keep doing this over and over again, and I have a phrase that I say, so again, some of you guys have heard me say this before, is hope springs eternal in the minds of idiots and fools. And so what happens is we keep hoping that they will change, and in so doing, with each time they don't, we get madder and more resentful. And before too long, I begin to realize that I've got a forgiveness issue on my hands now. And we sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes we'll end up kind of nurturing the wound as a result of this person, and get testy and think that our testiness or our short temper or whatever is going to tell them that to shape up because you're being mad with them or whatever it is you do. Yeah.
Remember, this will all get perfectly solved up when we get to the boundaries slide. But what would you say is like the biggest distinction between chance after chance after chance and grace, or 70 times 7?
Yeah.
Those, is it all entirely in drawing boundaries? Is it in your expectations that you give grace without expectation, or is giving them chances you have an expectation to change?
Yeah, you did a pretty good job answering it, actually. I mean, when Jesus was talking about, in the context of forgiveness, about 70 times 7, he was talking about certainly about infinity. Okay, he was piling up infinite numbers. It wasn't 490 and 491. You're dead. But the boundaries piece is that we sometimes don't recognize that forgiveness has boundaries in it. Now, that doesn't mean I don't forgive them, but it also means that I start to restrict access to parts of my heart based on their behavior. And so yeah, the boundaries helps that along. I think the chance after chance is the hope springs eternal idea. Is I keep giving them a chance because I think that chance will actually allow them to finally change, and it doesn't. And that's where the problem comes in. So the chance I'm giving them has an expectation tied to it. I may not recognize that it's there, but it is there. That, okay, I'll give you a chance this time, implied. Next time, you're going to pay the consequences of it. And so yes, boundaries will help that along. I think in the bigger picture of things, forgiveness is one thing, setting limits is another. And I can still be forgiving, but still have limits. And we don't usually talk about boundaries in the context of forgiveness. We think forgiveness is just collapsing our boundaries and then letting them have carte blanche again. And that never was intended that way at all. And even when you look at Scripture, Jesus didn't operate that way either. So he was very abrupt and even cruel, but direct with Pharisees, which is limit setting. He's calling them to change behavior. Do they change? Well, they didn't a lot of times. Some of them did. And yet, I think the one thing we miss is that Jesus' expectations were calculated against what he knew the Pharisees were like, not what he hoped they would be like. That's what this is a matter of hope. And I have no base for hope when the person keeps behaving the same way over and over again. So that's where that comes in. Did I get close to answering it? Yeah.
Kind of related. Like, say this is like a relationship between an abandoner and irresponsible, and like the abandoner or whatever is like getting annoyed and having to make excuses and whatever.
Right.
And so it's like, how do they like set boundaries without that boundary just being them leaving altogether?
Well, the abandoner is leaving anyway, right? I mean, if they're around one of these knuckleheads, I mean, they're saying, "Oh, see ya." Yeah, but I see. I don't think. I mean, boundaries are not abandoning. Boundaries are connecting. The problem is when we set boundaries, and we'll talk more about this. But when we set boundaries, it gives an opportunity for having clarity about who I am and who I'm not, and what I'm responsible for and what I'm not. These folks are not really. You're going to still have to have boundaries, and generally they will fade away because they're looking for somebody that has none. And so the abandoner, like the example I gave for myself, the abandoner, my friend was gracious enough to enter back into the relationship or stay in the relationship and invite me into a different way of living. If I wasn't willing to do that, it would have been very different. And sooner or later, there would be maybe phone call after phone call or other things. I wouldn't be engaging them, and eventually we just give up. And to some degree, it's not really giving up. It's saying, based on the behavior I see, it's clear the other person doesn't want this relationship. Okay, I respect that, and leaving it at that. But with these cases, the abandoner usually doesn't stay around very long. And so the interesting thing about this, and I've had a variety of people kind of point this out to me, students, is that sometimes military kids and missionary kids both wrestle with the abandonment thing. And so they have a little clock that's running in their head, and particularly with missionary kids. Military kids is a little bit more volatile, but for a lot of MKs, they know that their parents' furlough or whatever, home assignment, whatever they call it, is coming for 4 years, which means their relationships always have an expiration date. And so they're always kind of calculating that, and as the time grows closer, guess what they do? They pull away. And so they appear as an abandoner, when in fact, I don't think that's the motivation behind it. It's just trying to limit the amount of loss that they experience. That's really a fuller understanding of it. But the military kids are the same way. They are never in one place and very long. They don't expect relationships to last. And whenever that timer goes off and they start pulling away. And again, it's kind of an anticipatory preempting that they do. So now, what I want to do is switch gears. I gave you those 3 profiles. Like I said, nobody is one of these. People are mixtures of these. Sometimes, like I said last time, I think, is that depending on the relationship will depend on kind of what you tend toward. Okay, and you're not going to be uniformly all one of these. What I want to do 2 things. I want to look at personal characteristics, so the interior of the unsafe person. And then I want to look at the interpersonal, what happens when they're in relationship, okay? And then we'll start looking at what you're probably waiting for, and that is, okay, so how do I avoid being the unsafe person? In a lot of cases, the practice you get in groups is beyond useful. Okay, it's now, I don't know. Is practice something you always look forward to, Kristen? That's groups, right, Sage? Yeah, that's groups. So you might end up seeing certain of these profiles, certain of these characteristics while you're in the group, okay? It's like, so I'll pull away, I'll watch everybody else do their vulnerability thing, and I'll calculate a week 12 whether I'm going to get in or not. And so these profiles are pure. We're going to have interchanging parts here in terms of abandoning or irresponsibles or whatever it might be. This is not about condemnation, it's about being clear. So the first thing is interpersonal traits. With interpersonal traits, when I say that the unsafe person thinks they have it all together, it doesn't mean that, like if there was someone were in this category, and they sit down in the group and say, oh, by just so you all know, I got it all together. We don't ever say that. But we sure act that way. We always are ready on the spot with an answer for something, always. And so they think they have it all together is suggested by how they behave. Okay? And so if they go the critic route and they're about correction, most of the time, our tendency when we are around somebody like a critic, either we will kind of acquiesce to their certainty and their confidence and all that kind of stuff, or we'll push back and say, who died and left you in charge? One, and two, you act like you have it all together. And the funny thing about it is they'll say, oh no, but they always have an answer for everything. So they also come across as religious instead of spiritual. And what I mean by that is defined. They're committed more to appearing spiritual than actually cultivating a relationship with Jesus. So what they're talking about in their relationship with Jesus looks different. It may be very, very, very dated. It may be historical. It may be sound very stereotypical even. So they're devoted to looking spiritual. And when they're offered feedback, they get really pretty defensive. And this is the hard part of it. I think we all struggle with it, right? And some of it, or maybe even all of it, is because of shame. When somebody gives me feedback, I feel less, I feel weak, I feel inadequate, I feel worthless. And those things are what make it impossible for feedback to actually help me. And so, and the irony, the exquisite irony in all of this is our entire lives are built on feedback. Our entire lives are built on it. And what I mean by that is you guys have been in enough psych classes, you close your eyes and you still hold your body upright. You're using other feedback from the room and the sound and everything else. Or your muscles have opposite muscles, biceps, triceps. One extends, one contracts. See, all of the feedback is necessary for everything. In psychology, we call it proprioception, where you know where your body parts are in space. That's feedback on tension just within your arms. And so we live on feedback, and yet when it comes to feedback from somebody about us and our relationship with them, we start pushing away because shame is whispering in our ear, they're going to run away. They're going to leave because they found this flaw. And that's part of it. So, Another trait is that they're self-righteous instead of humble. You know, another phrase in Scripture oftentimes is they are righteous in their own eyes. That would be self-righteous. The one thing I'll remind you of, and like I said, there's a lot I repeat, and some of you guys have heard me say this before, but the word righteous in Scripture, a lot of times we translate it as perfect. When the word righteous, one of the meanings, not all of the meanings, but one of the meanings means to be rightly related. So somebody who's righteous, and God is the righteous, what he's really saying is they're right related to me. So when somebody is self-righteous, they're defining the fact that they're rightly related to whomever or to God or whatever you want. And they come across pretty arrogant. It's impossible to really even be perceived as humble. You know, the funny thing about humble people, they don't think they are. They don't even notice that they are. Why? Because they're not paying attention to it. See, humility is an outcome of something else. Humility is an outcome of an attitude of the heart. So whatever I cultivate, the fruit of it is humility. It's not something I put on my objective list to be, I'm going to be humble today. Because most of the time, my hitting that target, most of the time ends up looking like I'm going to self-deprecate more. Or I'm going to put myself down more, or I'm going to whatever. And that's not humility at all. As a matter of fact, I get very prideful over my false humility. So they only apologize instead of changing their behavior. You know, there's like characteristics that I have, and I've poked at people for when they say something, then they immediately apologize for it. And I end up saying, what are you being sorry for? Your freedom to say what you have to say? I mean, we apologize preemptively in like cases because what are we apologizing for? We don't want the person to be offended by what we just said, even though it was, well, is really consistent with what's going on inside of us. And so they avoid working on their problems instead of dealing with them. So they'll shove them off in other places. They'll shift responsibility, and unsafe people tend to do that. Now, again, remember the context in which I'm teaching you this. Shame. And shame is a driver for a lot of these behaviors in a lot of cases. And it makes us, it contributes to us, not makes us, but it contributes to us being unsafe people for other people. Because we're busy fighting the voice of shame. Here's 4 more. They believe that they're perfect instead of admitting their faults. So you remember what we said about the critic? They're always busy correcting things instead of connecting. So they blame others instead of taking responsibility. They shade the truth, lie instead of telling the truth. You probably have heard the phrase, a half truth is a whole lie. The minute I intermingle truth with something untrue, it's not true anymore. And then finally, they're instead of grown. So most of the time, the comments or the reactions or the stories that they tell are entirely historical. They're not present tense. They're not going right now. Now, that doesn't preclude, at times, saying, you know, what I found from my experience, that doesn't preclude that at all. But generally, if I'm going to say something like that, I probably can find evidence for it now, too. Which leads us then into vulnerability. See, vulnerability, one way to look vulnerable is to tell a lot of things about your history that you've sanitized to make look better. And you look vulnerable. But vulnerability is about what thoughts you're entertaining or you're struggling with today, now, right now. And they're there. We all have them. You know, we're complex enough that I can entertain multiple thoughts at the same time and still be talking to people. So there are things playing in the back of our heads all the time. So those are the personal characteristics, okay? They're interior to the person. There are things going on inside of them, and how it translates is into the interpersonal realm. And in the interpersonal realm, they avoid closeness instead of connecting. And a lot of these interpersonal things are really pretty subtle. I mean, people have a variety of avoiding closeness or creating distance. Might be a mirror image of that. And one of them, which at some level convicts us all, is telling people what I think rather than telling people what I feel. See, it's safe to talk about what I'm thinking about, really, because I've got full control over the sanitation level of that. But when I start talking about how it feels to me, that's a very different thing. Now, granted, people love to cloak their thoughts with feelings. I feel that, and then they tell you what they think. There are some people that will say, I think that, and they cloak their feelings in thought. Because we traffic in it. I mean, it's the academy. That's all we talk about, right? Knowledge and thought and cognition and all of that. But this touchy-feely, squishy feeling crap doesn't necessarily enter in, even though it drives the engine a lot of time. So they ultimately are concerned about the I instead of the we. The thing to keep in mind is to be safe is to have empathy that's supported by realistic and concrete action. And one of those actions, in terms of in the I instead of the we, is saying you versus, yeah, me too, kind of thing. And that doesn't mean always just saying those two words, me too. It's also saying making connection on common experiences. I think one of the biggest challenges oftentimes in group, and the folks that have been in the grief or loss can attest to this, one of the biggest challenges is making connection in a general sort of way rather than a specific sort of way. So somebody will talk about something, whatever the topic is, and say, well, I haven't had that, so I really have nothing to say. Versus looking at that as an instance of something larger that I do have something to say. I do have something to share. I have lots in common with. And so the groups often will grind to a halt because people are comparing specific instances rather than common experiences that they have to share with one another. We always do. We always do. We in some respects, we end up cultivating a blindness to that because we are so afraid of being known like that. So we just don't see it because we don't even think about it anymore. So they also resist freedom instead of encouraging it. Unsafe people have a propensity for communicating that no is not an acceptable answer. And so they communicate in a variety of ways. It's not like they say flat out. Most of the stuff people don't do it flat out. They don't say these things. As a matter of fact, they probably don't even know that they're thinking it, but it shows up in their behavior. But they don't communicate that no is an acceptable answer because that encourages freedom. And you know, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, it's like we spend a lot of time trying to preemptively prevent somebody from saying no to us, rather than actually give them the full information and letting them choose. And so they're busy on that front. They flatter us instead of confronting us, and they stay in very prescribed roles, whether it's parent or child, really rather than really connecting with us on the flat ground that is between us, that we're equals, we're the same, and we've got a lot of the same experiences. The biggest part of this, which is ironic really, is when you get into friendships and relationships, you're searching for what's similar. It seems like when you get into group, you're searching for everything that makes you dissimilar, so you don't have to talk and be able to make that kind of connection. It's pretty frightening. It's normal normal. The folks that are in group processing, you'll get it in action, and that will happen. That's just a normal part of groups, kind of figuring things out, figuring each other out. That's all part of it. It's a normal thing to have happen. And so it's not like, we're all going to join hands and jump into the deep end where all the sharks are. No, everybody's got a different timeline. We're not going to demand people. Remember, safe people resist freedom. So in groups that are safe, they communicate to the people that are part of those groups, you come at your own pace. You don't come the way everybody else does. That's okay. You don't have to. It's on your speed. So some other ones, they're unstable over time instead of being consistent. They are negative influence on us rather than a positive. Sometimes we end up saying that I'm kind of my worst person around, worst version of myself around this person. And in a lot of cases, they collect information and commodities that they can use in relationships with people. And so the interpersonal traits. See, the thing I'd have you pay attention to is that the people that are unsafe tend to interact with others as objects. In other words, there's something to be used rather than people to relate to. And that's in every case. If you walk out here and you feel you just got smacked upside the head, welcome to the party. Because all of us have gotten convicted by any one of these at any given point in time. Where we land is, again, that's why I do this class, is where we land is what gets in the way of our growth. Because of what shame chirps in our ear about us and who we are, because we make mistakes, we're flawed. We do things that hurt other people, we do things that disappoint people, and at times we are being unsafe. And owning that is the beginning of change. Remember, I said this to you, and some of you have heard me say it before, is I can't change what I refuse to accept. I can't change it. So it starts with acceptance, and it always does. All right, so now that we've made you sufficiently bleary-eyed with shame, are you a Satan? Here's some characteristics to cultivate. They draw us closer to God. What I mean by that is they value freedom and grace. As a matter of fact, a friend of mine that I mentioned to you at the beginning valued this. And he offered grace that actually contributed to my growth as being a consistent, faithful friend. So drawing us closer to God is showing us a picture of freedom and grace. They draw us closer to others. They value vulnerability, connection, and empathy. Empathy, the very essence of empathy, is connecting my experience with someone else's, being able to see the world through that lens. Me being moved with empathy means that I'm willing to use my experience so that I can understand their experience. And then 3, they help us become the real person God created us to be. Oftentimes, they're people that have vision. They can see things in us that they contribute to our growth in that same way. So they model all of these characteristics above with grace and truth. The challenge in a lot of ways, and certainly I think even within the church, is this tension that we live in between grace and truth. And oftentimes we over-tilt the balance to truth rather than grace. And part of the reason that we do that, our effort, because we want certain things. We don't, to some degree we can say, well, I'm just trying to help you not, whatever. forever. But that wouldn't be grace then. And so truth guides us, not only the validity of the internal truth of the person that I'm in, but also having a clear understanding of God's truth about worth and value and who I am and how I am and how you are and who you are and all of those things that really go along with it. So clearly, and this seemed kind of self-obvious, but I want to lay something out so it's clear. And obviously, the model of safety is Jesus. I think there was something we're paying attention to. Has anybody watched The Chosen? Anybody? And some of the things in there, what is it that made Jesus so safe? And I would suggest to you is how John actually started his letter, gospel. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That probably means more than just he hung out with us. Because dwelt among us literally means in the Hebrew, it means to tabernacle with. So go all the way back in the history of the Hebrews, and what was the center of camp? The tabernacle. And what eventually became the center of the civilization? The temple where God lived. So in translations, it says that Jesus, the Word became flesh and lived among us. And that's the whole idea of dwelling. Because dwelling, it means entering another's world and not taking on their stuff, able to dwell in it. That's dwelling. That's why I talk about boundaries, because essentially if I move into somebody's world, I'm probably going to get affected by their world. But if I have decent boundaries, I have the capacity to dwell with them in that place. And they don't feel quite so alone. And I can do that with words, I can do that with my presence, do that a lot of days. And then of course, in truth. Yeah, Chris.
But so if everyone has unsafe qualities or those, but they're unsafe at a certain point.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, at what point are you okay, that is an unsafe person in totality? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Or because I don't know, I can consider everyone, including myself.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I see them, immediately okay, no,
Which is now judgmental.
Yes,
Therefore, yeah.
But I'm just how do I balance that? If truth is that everyone has some of this,
Right.
When am I okay, well, I gotta give them a chance.
And then we get to the abandoner or the irresponsibles. Yeah, I think the answer to that question is that there are people in your life who are consistently safe. Now, when I say consistently, it doesn't mean they are always safe, but they are consistently safe, which means that on occasion there are going to be times where they don't handle things very well. They're not very safe at all. So, but they are consistently safe, which means I can still calibrate against them as a safe person in my life. It doesnn't absolve me of dealing with the boundary issue at all. I mean, some people can go through crises and other things in their lives, and they're not very safe with people around them because they're overrun with the crisis they're going through. Does that make them an unsafe person? No. We're thinking instead of heuristics here. You know, the unsafe person tends to be kind of this solid walled category, when in fact, they're being unsafe right now, rather than they are an unsafe person or that person is a safe. And generally, if we're going to translate that, that means then that they're consistently safe in my life, and therefore I'm willing to bring some walls down and invest in that relationship. So does that mean a consistently safe person is never unsafe? No. They're going to be at times. And that's what I think we have to, and that's why I always link these two things together. Interestingly enough, and I used to work with John Townsend and Henry Cloud, and they released the book Safe People before they ever released the Boundaries. The reasons that they did the Boundaries book was that question. Is that we have to talk about where I end and someone else starts. Now that we've figured out what's safe and unsafe, boundaries is part of it. That's one of the reasons these class times I'll do unsafe people, safe people stuff, and I'll talk about boundaries because they kind of fit together really, really well. Safe people have really good boundaries. And sometimes we don't want them to have good boundaries. We don't want to suffer the consequences of our behavior. And so, it's like we want somebody to join in the consequences of bad behavior. They won't. And actually, in some respects, that might actually tell us how safe to be. So boundaries is a very complimentary term, and that would go into the same thing that you're describing. Okay. Okay, so let's talk how to be safe. I'm sure this is what you've been waiting for. One of the first places we start is learning to ask for help. Now, one of the things that I think most of us deplore is feeling dependent or feeling weak. And we rush to, we've got the value even in our culture about self-sufficiency and independence and all that. But having the capacity to ask for help is in a lot of ways an indication of safety building, becoming a person. God places a high premium on the value of asking directly for help. Forms of the word ask appears 800 times in the book. Many of them are an invitation from God for us to ask things. Why do we not want to ask for things? Yeah, that would be the lowest hanging fruit. Very good. Yes, shame. What else? What are we avoiding? Vulnerability. What else are we avoiding? Yeah. I don't have enough. Absolutely. What else? Yeah.
We don't want to burden others.
We don't want to burden others. Or we don't want to be a burden. Should I put that in there? Were you going to say something?
Yeah, well, we don't understand it because things are trade and we ask for something, we're going to have to pay it back.
Yep. Yeah, so it obligates us, for sure. Yeah. Looking weak. Yeah, very good. There's one other thing. Yeah. Yeah. We don't ask because we don't want to hear no. Yeah. Right there. Plain as a nose on your face. We don't know. So we don't ask. Which says what? No is not an acceptable answer. We've just listened to being safe. Right? I'm damned if I do and damned if I don't. See, that's where the rubber meets the road, folks. Because if for sure the other person says no and we answer for them, we have just stolen their opportunity to say yes. Because if they have the freedom to say no, they also have the freedom to say yes. They go together. In a lot of cases, we spend more time in our important relationships with those people in our head than we do in real time in the space between us. And that's a lot of that is informed by this voice of shame that we've been talking about. So learn to ask help. Another one. Well, reasons. We've already talked about some of these. Ultimately, I learned humility by asking for help. You just hinted at a lot of this. Owning my own needs. Oh, now that's a big topic. Needs? Who has needs? I don't need anything. I'll come back to it. Taking the initiative, developing a grateful character. After all, if I ask, somebody says yes. It increases the odds that we'll get something. I'm going to come back to the needs thing because it's pretty important. So each one of these are reasons for us to actually ask for help. It doesn't mean all the time. That's just it. A lot of times we argue about these points from an extreme and say, well, does that mean I'm just asking all the time? I don't ever do anything. I'm just asking people to do something for me all the time. Okay, now we're arguing from the extreme. But when I recognize that I don't have enough, that ties into our topic of the day. When I recognize I don't have enough, then I ask for help. That deepens my relationship with other people, but it also embraces that I'm limited. And I don't know about you, but I don't like being reminded how limited I am. I don't. We ourselves on being sufficient. Now, let me back to this needs thing, because it carries with it more. Because the idea of learning to need, we have it contaminated with very much of a shame-based evaluation. Learning to need is the same as being needy. And most people, when they hear me talk about the needy thing, that's how they translate it. I'm being needy. If I have to ask somebody for something, and ironically, in a lot of families, this same mythology exists. A lot of marriage relationships that I've been around and even I've counseled, and usually what happens is the spouse ends up saying, "I have to tell you what I want. It doesn't matter anymore. If you loved me, you would know what I want." But that's not owning my needs. That's not owning my own needs. It's somebody else doing my work. So the idea of neediness, the thing about it, we'll talk about this, we start talking about this thing, self stuff. But somewhere along the way, we don't think a thing about being needy as little kids. I was walking out of church with my grandsons yesterday. Feels like 3 years ago. And I have two. A third is coming. And Grayson's 6, and Desi is 3. And so we were walking into the parking lot. A lot of these building stuff, they have concrete poles that are basically block and keeping somebody from kind of charging through the parking lot or anything like that. Anyway, walking up to it, and Desi, I lovingly refer to him as Desi Destructo. What he touches, he destroys. Okay, and whatever he sees, he has to conquer. And I probably could add that to his name too. And so we're walking up to one of these poles, and he looked at it. I could see the wheels turning, and it's like, I want to jump over that thing. And he sized it up very accurately and said, "Lift me up." And I pick him up and I put him on the pole, and he grabs up and climbs up over it, and I help him get down again. And not 1 ounce of shame was shown for asking. Not 1 ounce of shame was shown. He didn't even think about it. He saw he couldn't do it. He just asked, had fun in the process, strained my back, but it's fine. And that's the kind of stuff. But somewhere along the way, we get this message: don't need. And if you do need, it's a point of shame. So confessing our inability to own our own needs is the beginning point of this stuff. Now that sounds very, very vulnerable, right? I mean, we've been talking about that all along. Don't fake it, keep boundaries, confess the need you can't experience. I mean, there are some needs that we recognize are there. We really don't feel it, but we know it's there because we're afraid of it. And pay attention to what evokes your hunger or passion, because that probably will lead you to a need somewhere. And that is the landscape that I can begin to embrace, what the landscape of my own heart is, which includes the needs that I have. And everybody has a little bit different. They communicate it differently. Some of it we've owned or not owned it, that we don't recognize it. And that's really the long journey of owning ourselves. Because I can't give away what I don't own. Okay? All right, I'm going to stop. Any questions? Okay, more to come on Wednesday. See ya.